Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This video is about blood supply of brain. It's not truly anatomical perspective, and it is going to be the basis for cerebrovascular diseases to understand the cerebrovascular diseases. So we are going to talk about blood supply of brain. So the brain receives two types of blood supply. So the anterior part of the brain receives blood supply from the carotid. Posterior part of the brain receives blood from the vertebral arteries. Vertebral arteries. And these two arteries comes come from the aorta, from the main branches of the aorta. Okay, that is from the arch of aorta. So the artery which comes in the posterior and goes into the brain and supplies the various parts of the brain. So that is from the vertebral artery, and this circulation is called posterior circulation of brain. This circulation is called posterior circulation, or sometimes they call it as a vertebral basilar circulation because it supplies the basilar part of the brain. It is always called vertebral basilar circulation. The anterior circulation, which comes from the carotid artery and it goes to the anterior parts of the brain, which supplies the anterior parts of the brain, mainly the cerebral cortex, and that is called anterior circulation. These two vessels, that is which is coming from the anterior side and which is coming from the posterior side, they are all connected. They both have communication. And this vessels once enters the central nervous system, and they once enter the central nervous system, they stay in the subarachnoid space and they give branches to the different parts of the brain. And they give branches to the different parts of the brain, but actually they enter and they go to the subarachnoid space. From there they gives the major branches which supplies the interior parts of the brain, the corresponding parts of the brain, and which goes interior to the brain and various supplies the various parts of the brain interior. Okay, so we are going to talk about the blood supply of the brain on three uh, perspective. One is from the posterior side and one is from the anterior side, and the communication between the posterior and the anterior, as well as we are going to discuss about especially about uh, how what are the main branches which supplies the interior part of the brain, the major parts of the brain. So if they have any defect in the supply of the brain, which area of the brain is affected according to how the clinical symptoms and signs are produced. So if you understand this, it is a holistic view of understanding the blood supply of the brain, then you will understand very well about the cerebrovascular diseases, which we are going to discuss after the blood supply of the brain. So this is a brief introduction about what we are going to do now. Okay, so let us to study the blood supply of the brain. It is always better to start from the heart. It is always better to start from the heart. Okay, so you all know uh, the left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium. So this is the left atrium. Okay, and this receives blood, this sends blood to the left ventricle, and by crossing the mitral valve, here we have aortic valve, from where the blood goes to the aorta. Okay, so this is the left atrium, this is the left ventricle, and this is the my aortic valve, and this is the mitral valve, and you all know this is the arch of aorta. Okay, from the arch of aorta, three major vessels comes on the right side. It is the, what is this? This is the brachiocephalic, this is the brachiocephalic trunk, and after that followed by, then it is the left internal carotid artery, sorry, left common carotid artery, sorry, left common carotid artery, then left subclavian artery. So what are the branches comes from the arch of aorta? So first is brachiocephalic trunk, and followed by left common carotid artery. So this is brachiocephalic trunk, and then it is left common carotid artery, then followed by left subclavian artery. Okay, from the brachiocephalic trunk, the two arteries comes out. It gives branches to the two major vessels. What are they? One is right subclavian artery, then right common carotid artery. Okay, so now you all know the major branches which is coming from the arch of aorta. Okay, once again I am telling, the blood, left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circulation, and it sends the blood to the left ventricle by crossing the mitral valve. Then from the left ventricle goes for systole, and it sends the blood to the arch of aorta, that is the aorta, by crossing the uh, aortic valve. Okay. So once the blood enters the arch of aorta, the first major branch which comes from the arch of aorta is the brachiocephalic trunk. The blood enters the brachiocephalic trunk. Then, followed by the brachiocephalic trunk, we have a left common carotid artery. Then the blood enters the left common carotid artery. After that, the blood enters the left subclavian artery. Then it goes on. So, in the brachiocephalic trunk, there are two branches, that is right subclavian artery, other one is right common carotid artery. Okay. Now let us concentrate on the subclavian arteries. From the subclavian arteries, that is from the right and left, there are two branches which comes out. From the right subclavian artery, a branch comes from the posterior side and runs posteriorly, that is right vertebral artery. So this is right vertebral artery. Likewise, there is another artery which comes from the left subclavian artery and goes posteriorly, that is left vertebral artery. So once this branches comes out, it goes posteriorly and they meet the vertebra, run posteriorly and go near to the vertebra and go to the vertebra, sorry, it goes to the vertebra, and in the vertebra, for example, this is the vertebra. Okay. The vertebra is the transverse process of the vertebra. There is a foramen which is present in the transverse process of the vertebra. Okay, this is the spinal cord. Okay. This is the spinal cord, and this is the transverse process of the vertebra. A process in the a foramen in the transverse process, and the vertebral arteries enters this vertebra and it goes through this foramen. So now the vertebral arteries are traveling towards the brain by crossing the foramen in the transverse process, by entering the foramen in the transverse process. So once again I am telling, there are two branches which comes from the subclavian artery, that is from the both sides, right and the left subclavian artery, and runs posteriorly. So that is nothing but that is a vertebral artery, that is right and left vertebral artery. They go posteriorly, then they go to the foramen in the transverse process of the vertebra, and it goes above towards the foramen magnum. So this is how the vertebral artery gets started from the subclavian artery. So okay, now let us see how it enters the foramen magnum. Okay, now these are the small opening in the transverse process of the vertebra. Okay, that is foramen in the transverse process. So this is the heart. This is the arch of aorta. Okay. Okay, and this is the vertebral arteries, and it goes to the crosses, it enters the foramen and the transverse process, it goes above. Okay, it goes above from both sides. Okay, then it goes till it reaches the, this is the back side of the skull, and this is the foramen. Where the spinal cord comes out, foramen, magnum. Okay, so once it enters the foramen magnum, okay, let us see what are the structures at the back side of the brain. Okay, so we have, so let us start from the midbrain. We have midbrain. Okay, then we have pons. Then we have medulla. From medulla, spinal cord comes out of the foramen magnum, comes out to the foramen magnum. So in the midbrain, then it comes the pons, and in between the pons and medulla, that is a junction which is called pons medullary junction. So now coming to the vertebral arteries, they enter the foramen magnum and they go till near the pons medullary junction. Okay, goes till near the pons medullary junction. What is this? This is left vertebral artery. So what is this? It is right vertebral artery. So they go till near the pons medullary junction. Okay. So here I want to stress one more point. Once they enter the foramen magnum, so the brain is covered by the meninges. Okay. So dura, arachnoid, and pia. So first they pierce the dura, then they pierce the arachnoid, and then they go to the subarachnoid space. In the subarachnoid space, the entering vessels are just floating in the cerebrospinal fluid, and they will be there. From there, the main branches arises and it pierces the pia and goes to the brain substances. Understand? So now what are the vessels which we are going to talk? That all are going to be in the subarachnoid space. Okay. So if these blood vessels rupture, the bleeding occurs in the subarachnoid space. So please don't forget that. And now you all know the left vertebral artery and the right vertebral artery goes to the foramen magnum and it pierces the dura and it pierces the arachnoid and they enter the subarachnoid space and they go above the medulla and they meet near the pons medullary junction. Okay. After that, they join right and left vertebral artery, fuse together, and they form the basilar artery, very important artery. Then they go to the till the midbrain, end of the midbrain. Okay. So now this is how the vertebral artery enters the foramen magnum and forms the basilar artery. So while entering the foramen magnum, okay, they give two branches which comes down the foramen magnum and they join together and they form the anterior spinal artery. So what is this? This is anterior spinal artery. This is anterior spinal artery. Okay. So remember this anterior spinal artery, when they are coming from the vertebral artery, they have good volume of blood. When they go down, the volume of blood will be reduced. Volume of blood will be reduced. So to have a good blood supply to the spinal cord, this anterior spinal artery receives blood from the neighboring arteries which is running on that side, which is running on that side. Just to show those arteries, I am just erasing the label things. Okay. So now let's concentrate on the anterior spinal artery. So here this side, in the cervical side, a group of blood vessels which is running, that we call it as a deep cervical arteries. And if it is a in the thorax side, there is a group of blood vessels running, that is called intercostal arteries. And still further down, there are group of blood vessels running, that is called lumbar arteries. So this anterior spinal artery receives segmental branches from these arteries and it supports the perfusion of the in the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the segmental arteries. One more thing we should understand, there is a major vessel, one major vessel which comes directly from the aorta, that is comes directly from the aorta, that comes directly from the aorta. So that is called as great median artery of Adam, great median artery of Adam, and which supplies the anterior part of the spinal cord. Even though this anterior spinal artery gets supporting blood supply and some support from the neighboring arteries, still there are two areas are very weak on the anterior side of the spinal cord, because the anterior spinal artery supplies anterior two-third of the spinal cord, and posterior one-third is supplied by the posterior spinal artery. Inshallah, I'll discuss about that. Now you concentrate on the anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery supplies what? Two-third of the anterior part of spinal cord. Anterior part of spinal cord. So even though they get such a supporting vessels, there are two areas known to be called as less perfused area. So that area is located at the T4 and the L1 level. So this level of spinal cord that is located at the T4 and L1 is known to go for infarction. It is known to go for ischemia related injury when the anterior spinal artery receives less blood supply, because already this area has received physiologically less blood supply. If the anterior spinal artery, due to some reasons, if it receives less blood supply, this area will go for infarction. Okay, so this is the pathological point of view, you should not forget. Okay, now let us discuss about the posterior spinal artery, how it comes. So to discuss about the posterior spinal artery, I am going to draw another structure in the brain, very important structure in the brain. I hope you all know, that is the cerebellum. That is the cerebellum. Okay, so this is the cerebellum, and it has superior and inferior lobes. Okay, and the inferior lobe, that is posterior part of the inferior cerebellum, receives blood supply from the vertebral artery. Carefully see this, from the vertebral artery, okay, and that is called posterior inferior, easy to name it. It is supplying the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum. It is called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Don't call by abbreviation. I always tell the students, then you will forget the name explanation of the abbreviation. So it is called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Cerebellar artery. Okay. And just above that another branch comes out from the vertebral artery. It supplies the anterior inferior part. Okay, anterior inferior part, that is called anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It is called anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So once again, just I draw the parts of the brain here. This is, just label the parts of the brain: midbrain. This is pons, okay, and this is medulla, and what is this? Cerebellum. Okay, so once again, just I recap it. Okay, the vertebral arteries come from the subclavian artery. The right subclavian artery comes from the brachiocephalic trunk, whereas left subclavian artery directly comes from the arch of aorta. Okay. From this right and left subclavian artery, we get a branch, that is vertebral artery. Okay. The right vertebral artery goes posteriorly. Okay, and it goes to the, what is this process? It is the process which is located in the, it is a foramen located in the transverse process. Then it goes to the foramen and it goes above. Then it reaches the foramen magnum both sides, and it enters the foramen magnum by piercing the dura, by piercing the arachnoid, and they stop at the subarachnoid space and they freely float in the cerebrospinal fluid. Then they go above over the medulla, and they till they meet the pons medullary junction, they will be separate arteries. Above the pons medullary junction, they form the basilar artery, and now when they enter into the foramen magnum, they give you a branch to the cerebellum, that is posterior inferior part of cerebellum, that is posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and above that they give another branch, that is the anterior inferior part of the cerebellum, that goes to the anterior inferior part of cerebellum, that is called anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay. And just below the foramen magnum, they give two branches, that is that fuse and they form the anterior spinal artery. And you all know the anterior spinal artery, in the beginning they have very good flow of blood, and when they go down, the blood flow of blood is reduced. So they need support from the neighboring arteries, that is they give the supporting arteries and small branches from those arteries which supplies the spinal cord. They help in perfusion of the spinal cord. So this come from the neck side, it comes from the deep cervical arteries, and in the thorax side it comes from the intercostal arteries, and in the lower, in the lumbar region, it comes from the lumbar arteries. And you also should remember a major vessel which arises from the arch of aorta, from the aorta. It is the great median artery of Adam, which supplies the anterior part of the spinal cord. Now let us discuss about the posterior part. Remember, there are two zones in the anterior part of the spinal cord, that is T3 and T4, T4 and L1. T4 and L1 level of the spinal cord, which receives less blood supply even though such supporting arteries are there. So when there is any less blood entering the anterior spinal artery, T4 and L1 goes for infarction. So now let us concentrate on the posterior supply, the spinal cord. So there are two arteries which comes from the vertebral artery and runs posteriorly, and to the, but they don't fuse, and they run as a two posterior spinal artery. They run as a two posterior spinal artery. Okay, and they supply the posterior one third of the posterior. This is posterior spinal artery, and they supply one third of the posterior spinal cord. Understand? Sometimes these branches, posterior spinal artery, can come from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery in some persons. Okay, so there is two way of posterior spinal artery. One is it can directly come from the vertebral artery, or it can come from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, so this posterior spinal artery, they don't fuse, but they run as a separately as a two posterior spinal arteries at the posterior part of the spinal cord. See, remember, in the anterior spinal artery there are two weak areas, that is T4 and L1, whereas in the posterior spinal artery supply the weak areas are located at T1, T2 and T3 area. Understand? So T1, T2 and T3 area. Okay. So now let us go what is happening above the spinal cord. So in the above the spinal cord, from the vertebral artery they give a branch that is nothing but to the posterior inferior part of the spinal cord, right? So that is called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Sorry, they give a branch to the cerebellum, that is posterior inferior part of cerebellum, that is called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Then above that they give another branch that is called anterior inferior cerebellar artery, that supplies the anterior inferior part of the cerebellum. So after that they fuse at the level of pons medullary junction and they form the basilar artery. From down to the basilar artery they give another branch to the cerebellum, that is superior part of cerebellum, that is called superior cerebellar, that is called superior cerebellar arteries. Okay, so the superior cerebellar arteries supplies the superior part of the cerebellum, and the basilar artery gives branches to the pons part of the brain, so that is poncellar arteries, and they also supply to the midbrain. Okay, and just above the superior cerebellar arteries branch they give a very lengthy branch which goes to the, this is the ear, and here we have a outer ear, middle ear and inner ear. Inner ear they have circles, semi circles, and they also have some membranes, that is called labyrinthine membranes. And this artery, this very lengthy artery, goes to the inner ear, okay, and they supply the labyrinth part of the inner ear, that is called labyrinthine artery. That is called labyrinthine artery, very lengthy branch. Okay, then above the midbrain Okay, just above the midbrain, they give another two major branch that goes posteriorly. Okay, that is going posterior part of cerebrum. That is called posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery. Okay, so that ends the posterior circulation. Okay, so let's recap the posterior circulation. Okay, the posterior circulation all comes from the vertebral artery. You should know where the vertebral artery comes from. Vertebral artery is the right and left. There are two vertebral arteries, right and left vertebral arteries. The right vertebral arteries come from the right subclavian. The right subclavian artery comes from the brachiocephalic trunk. And the brachiocephalic trunk is the first major branch which is coming from the arch of aorta. Okay. Then the left vertebral artery comes from the left subclavian. Left subclavian directly comes from the arch of aorta. Okay. And they all run posteriorly, and posteriorly they go to the vertebra and they go to the foramen in the transverse process. Okay, foramen in the transverse process, and they crosses all the foramen of the vertebrae and they go to the foramen magnum. In the foramen magnum, they enter into the cranium and they pierce the dura, they pierce the arachnoid, they go to the subarachnoid space, and they just literally floating in the CSF, coolly floating in the subarachnoid space. Okay, and when they enter into the foramen magnum, they go till the pons medullary junction and they fuse and they form basilar artery. Below the foramen magnum, they give the two branches from the right and left, and they fuse together at the anterior part of the spinal cord and they form the anterior spinal artery. And the anterior spinal artery, they have good volume of blood when they are starting. When they go down, the blood volume is reduced and they need support. The supporting arteries come from the deep cervical artery, intercostal artery and lumbar artery. These arteries give some segmental branches for the help in the perfusion of the spinal cord. And there is another major vessel which comes from the directly from the aorta, that is the great median artery of Adam. Great median artery of Adam, which also supplies the anterior spinal cord. And remember, the anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord is supplied by the anterior spinal artery. Anterior two-thirds is supplied by the anterior spinal artery. So even though they have such supporting vessels, still there are two areas or get less blood supply, that is usually goes for infarction, that is T4 and L1 area. Okay, the posterior spinal artery gets formed from the vertebral artery and they go posteriorly as a two posterior spinal artery. Sometimes it can come from another branch called posterior inferior cerebral artery, which itself a branch of the right and left vertebral artery. Understand? And they supply the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. In the posterior spinal artery supply area, there are three zones which is weak, that is T1, T2 and T3. Okay. So now let's go into the foramen magnum. Let's see what happening. So when they enter when the vertebral arteries enter the foramen magnum, they supply to the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum, that is called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And they are just above the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, they give another branch that is called anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And above the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, they give another branch that goes, actually they above the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, they go to the pons medullary junction and they fuse and they form the basilar artery. From the downward part of the basilar artery, they give you branches that is called, that supplies the superior cerebellar area, that is called superior cerebellar artery. From above that superior cerebellar artery, there is a very lengthy artery which goes to the inner part of the ear, that is called labyrinthine artery. Then at the end of the basilar artery, they give you a very big major blood branch that is called posterior, that runs posteriorly to the cerebral cortex, that is called posterior cerebral artery. Understand? So from till the posterior cerebral artery, this is the posterior circulation, otherwise called as vertebrobasilar circulation. Okay. Now let us discuss about the anterior circulation. Now let us discuss about the anterior circulation. Again I am going to draw the heart. Okay. And from the arch of aorta, first major vessel which comes is so it's a brachiocephalic trunk. From the base of brachiocephalic trunk, the two vessels comes, that is right common carotid artery and right subclavian artery. After that, the another branch comes from the aorta, arch of aorta, that is the left common carotid artery. After that, another branch which comes is left subclavian artery. Now let us concentrate on the carotid artery. Okay. So this carotid artery, that is right carotid artery, comes from the brachiocephalic trunk, and the left carotid artery comes from the arch of aorta. Okay. Let us draw the skull. Just I am cutting the skull transversely. Okay. You have to imagine a lot while you are studying medicine. Okay. Now this is the anterior cranial fossa, and this is middle cranial fossa, and this is posterior cranial fossa. This is foramen magnum. Okay. So understand? So this is the transverse section. So we cut the skull horizontally. Okay. And this skull bone has two layers, that is we call it outer and inner tap. Okay. Now this carotid arteries, okay, let us take the right side. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Okay. They form a sinus, that is carotid sinus, and they go to the middle cranial fossa. Okay, in the middle cranial fossa they have a carotid canal. The carotid canal is open outside, not inside the cranium. Okay, and they connect. The carotid canal gets connected with the foramen laceratum, and this artery, carotid artery, enters the carotid canal and takes a right turn, and it goes to the foramen laceratum. It comes inside the cranium. Actually, the relationship inside the cranium is cavernous sinus. Okay, that means they pierce the dura, they pierce the arachnoid, they enter the subarachnoid space. Okay, once they enter the subarachnoid space, they make a big U-turn. Okay, let's stop here. Why there is this much of turning in this small area? Because these arteries are coming directly from the arch of aorta, and they have full pressure, and that pressure has to be reduced, so they have lot of breakups, this kind of U-turn. So the pressure, the flow will be reduced, automatically the pressure will be reduced. So now from this, once they enter the cranium, that is in the subarachnoid space, they give branches. Okay, one of the branch which is very important, that is a branch which supplies the, which enters the orbit, that is called ophthalmic artery. In the orbit we have eyeball, and from the ophthalmic artery there are many branches. One branch is central artery, it goes to the retina. Okay, so this is ophthalmic artery and this is central artery. Okay, for example, it is a pediatric child, okay, who has rheumatic disease, rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, and they are, this is known for creating some vegetation in the mitral valve and the aortic valve, and when the blood is flowing from the right atrium to left ventricle, these vegetations can get break, or thrombotic bacterial vegetation can get break, and they can enter into the circulation. They can reach the arch of aorta. From the arch of aorta, they can enter the brachiocephalic trunk. When they enter the brachiocephalic trunk, they can go into the right coronary artery, and the right coronary artery they can go across the carotid sinus, and they can go above till they reach the till they reach the till they reach the ophthalmic artery, and in the ophthalmic artery they can go to the central artery, and they can cause block in the central artery. The whole eye goes for infarction, and creates that creates right-sided blindness. Creates right-sided blindness. Okay, this is so if you understand this vessel, then only you can understand the pathology. Okay, this is very important. Okay, here we have uh, cerebrum. Okay, and this is the tentorium, and here we have cerebellum, going past middle of, okay, because we cut the brain like this branches here. So here, from here there is another branch which comes out, that goes to the anterior part of the cerebrum, that is called anterior cerebral artery. It is called anterior cerebral artery, and another artery which goes medially, that is medial cerebral artery. Okay, one thing I want to tell you guys, that is just near to the ophthalmic artery branch, they give another branch which goes to the ventricle. Okay, and they supply the choroid plexus. They supply the choroid plexus. Choroid branches to the choroid artery, which comes from the carotid, that supplies to the choroid plexus. Understand? For example, when there is severe form of hypertension, so the hypertension will reflect in this major vessel, and the choroid plexus artery gets ruptured. They produce massive bleeding in the ventricle. They suddenly raise the intracranial pressure, and the patient gets severe throbbing headache and they collapse. Okay, these are the things can happen in severe form of hypertension. Now we understand this anterior circulation. Once again, I'm telling the anterior circulation. The right and left common carotid artery, the right common carotid artery comes from the brachiocephalic trunk, and the brachiocephalic trunk comes from the arch of aorta. So this is what happening here, and the left common carotid artery comes directly from the arch of aorta. Okay. Now the right coronary artery, just I'm taking example of right side. The same thing happens in the left side. The right coronary artery just goes above and they form the carotid sinus. Then they go above and they go into the medial cranial fossa and they go enter the, see this, they enter at the base of the skull. Okay, so that's why that's why I made the transverse section. You are seeing the base of the skull, from above, so that's why we made a transverse section. So once they enter the cranial fossa, sorry, cranial canal, they cannot come out that means they cannot come inside the cranium because the cranial canal is closed inside. So they take a turn and they go to the foramen laceratum and they enter the cranium. Once they enter the cranium, they give you a branch called ophthalmic artery, and from there the another branch which comes, that is the central artery. And the pathological point of view is, if there is any valvular vegetation in rheumatic heart disease, that vegetation can go into the right coronary artery and they can go into the ophthalmic artery and they can go into the central artery and they can damage the eye. Okay, they can create blindness. And there is another branch which supplies the choroid plexus. Okay, and that can also get goes for rupture when there is severe hypertension. They produce massive bleeding in the ventricle. And then the major branches which comes from the carotid artery is anterior cerebral artery, which supplies the anterior part of the cerebral cortex, and middle cerebral artery, which supplies the middle part of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and the same thing happens here. The same thing happens on the other side. Okay, the same thing happens on the other side. This is the anterior cerebral artery coming from the other side. Remember, these two arteries has the two anterior cerebral arteries has communication, that is called anterior communicating artery. That is called anterior communicating artery. Okay. So I'm going to draw this same anterior circulation at the base of the skull. Concentrate now. Okay, this is foramen magnum. This is here, and this is the pituitary fossa, sella turcica, and okay, this is anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and we have posterior cranial fossa, and this is foramen magnum, and this is the external acoustic meter from the form measuring. Okay, this is the nerve here. Okay, now let us see, and this is the base of the skull, this is the cranial canal open. Okay, now I'm going to use green color for the posterior circulation. What is this? This is left vertebral artery, this is right vertebral artery. Okay, now we are going to discuss only the things which is they are going to give branches inside the foramen magnum. Okay, first branch is posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, then they are going, the next branch is anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, then they are meeting the pons medullary junction and they form the what, basilar artery. Okay, at the starting of the basilar artery they give a branch, that is superior cerebellar artery, and then they give another branch which is a lengthy branch which goes to the labyrinthine, that is minor ear labyrinthine artery. From the top of the basilar artery they give another major branch that goes to the posterior part, that is posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery. So this is all posterior circulation. Okay, now let's draw anterior circulation in blue color. Okay, this is the carotid artery, right and left carotid artery, which comes inside by through the carotid canal going to the foramen lacerate. Okay, and they give the anterior branch. Okay, and they also give the middle cerebral artery branch. This is anterior cerebral artery and this is middle cerebral artery. And between the right anterior cerebral artery and the left anterior cerebral artery there is a communication that is called anterior communicating artery. Understand? And there is a communication between the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral artery. Very important communication. What is this name? Posterior communicating artery. Okay, so now we have two communicating artery. Okay, so this anterior communicating artery connects the right and left anterior circulation, whereas posterior cerebral artery communicates the anterior and posterior circulation. Okay, so at the base of the brain, that is in the subarachnoid space, they form this communication and this forms like a circle that is called circle of Willis. Circle of Willis or Willis you can call it anyway. So you please understand it is circle of Willis. So this is very important. Why? Because this is the anastomosing communicating branches of locator. Okay. So now you should. I'm going to tell some pathological point of view. So whenever this uh, uh, branches come from the major vessels, for example, posterior cerebral artery comes from the basilar artery, right? And this junction is the weak area. The blood vessels become weak and they go for dilation. Likewise, uh, in the anterior circulation, the branches which is coming out from the internal carotid artery, this area can go for dilation. Okay, this dilation due to weakness in the blood vessel, and that is called aneurysm, and this looks like a berry shape, so it is called berry aneurysm. Otherwise uh, uh, this otherwise called as saccular aneurysm because of the saccular shape. And this aneurysm, if they get ruptured, and remember this aneurysm most commonly seen in the anterior circulation. 90% of this aneurysm are commonly seen in the anterior circulation. If they get ruptured, they produce massive bleeding in which space? Subarachnoid space. Okay, because this whole thing is happening in the subarachnoid space. So this is the communication between the anterior and the posterior circulation. Okay, so now we discussed about posterior circulation, then we discussed about anterior circulation, and now we discussed about the communication between the anterior and posterior circulation, as well as communication between the right and left anterior circulation. Okay, so now let us see how these blood vessels are going to supply inside the brain. Okay, okay. So for that, I'm going to draw the brain in 2-3 different sections. Okay, so let us take brain in sujood position. Okay, so it is like seeing the brain from the lateral perspective. Okay, and see, this is the medial side. Okay, just you see, this is one position, and there is a sagittal section. I'm going to draw. Okay, this is anterior, this is posterior, and this is, you are seeing, is the corpus callosum. Okay, and this is anterior side, and remember, this is the internal carotid artery which enters. Okay, and they give two branches. Okay, one medial branch. This anterior branch which goes in between, see, this is sagittal section. Okay, and it is a vertical section of the brain, and otherwise called medial section, and you are seeing the area between the two cortex, and this anterior circulation goes inside in between the lobes, and they surrounds the corpus callosum, and they give branches to the interior part of the cerebrum like this, and these branches comes outside like this. Understand? This is how they give the branch. So now let's see in this way. So it comes like this. Comes like this. Understand? Comes like this. This is lateral sulcus. Okay. So this is how the anterior cerebral artery gives branches. Okay. So the middle cerebral artery, actually now I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to lift this lobe. Okay, I'm going to separate the two lobes of the cerebrum, okay, from the lateral sulcus. So just okay, understand, first I lifted it. If you see, once it gets lifted, you can see the middle cerebral artery which running in the lateral sulcus and coming out like this. So it is coming out like this. When the middle cerebral artery coming out like this, and they giving branches to the inner side of the brain, inner side of the brain, and the middle cerebral artery, once it enters this is lateral superior part of the brain, and it gives radiating branches. So we have two zones which is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, and this is the area posterior cerebral artery supplies. Posterior cerebral artery supplies. So there are areas supplied by the middle cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Okay, and this is the area called motor area. Okay, our movements are all controlled by this area, and the head area is controlled like this, and then the hand, then the body, then the leg. Okay, so the leg motor area is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, and rest of the body area is supplied by the motor cerebral artery. Okay, for example, if the person's right left sided leg is weak or paralyzed, so then the right sided brain is affected. And which part of the circulation is involved? Anterior circulation is involved. Anterior cerebral artery is involved. Anterior circulation is involved, and anterior cerebral artery is involved, because both legs are affected. If both hands and body are affected, then middle cerebral artery is involved. If leg and hand, all the body is affected, then which means if the person's both the legs and the hand are affected, which means you can say that both arteries are involved. But I'm going to tell one more thing, then you will understand what is involved. Okay, just I'm drawing the transverse section of the brain. That artery is called lenticular branch from the middle cerebral artery. Okay, and always in the transverse section you can see the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. And the internal capsule we have very important nucleus called